you. Okay, and this is quite a title, the stomach here. So, all right. He's got a nice shorter one up here as well. So
Much better. Yes. Okay. So yes, go ahead. Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. So my name is Hendrix. I am at Stony Brook University, and today I'm going to talk about the reactivity of lunar minerals. So as we move on into the century, there's going to be an increased interest in going into space, particularly by the private sector. And so since the moon is so close, that's most likely where we're going to go to next. So the moon could be used for a variety of purposes, including mining and vacationing. So, so that would be cool. So visits on the moon could last for weeks to even years, compared to just about a week for the Apollo missions. So some hazards associated with space travel include cosmic rays from outer space, UV rays from the sun. So if we have a human on the surface of the moon, then they're not protected by all of these hazards because the moon has a very, very thin atmosphere. So that's sort of one issue that you have on the moon. Another issue that many people may not necessarily realize or think of at first is that associated with lunar dust. So low rates of physical weathering on the surface of the moon cause lunar dust to be very angular, sharp, and so whenever someone would inhale that, that can cause a lot of physical damage in the tissues. And so similar effects that could come about from inhaling lunar dust could include those similar to silicosis and asbestosis. Iron and defect sites present in lunar minerals may cause the generation of reactive chemical species inside the body, so that's another hazard to look out for. When the Apollo astronauts were actually up there, they reported feeling bad side effects, including nausea, headaches, fever, and irritation in their nasal passages, and they refer to these symptoms as lunar dust hay fever. So what minerals are present on the moon? Well, on the mare, it's mostly all basalt, so you have a small percentage of plagioclase and high percentages of pyroxene, olivine, and iron titanium oxides. In the highlands, it's mostly composed of anorthosite, so it's going to be about 90+% anorthite and 0 to 10% mafic minerals. So in our lab, for our mafic mineral analogs, we have forsterite, dioxide, and augite. For our felsic mineral analogs, we have bitonite, labradorite, albite, and quartz. So bitonite and labradorite aren't anorthite, but they're close enough that we can use them as good analogs. Albite is not very common. It's not common at all on the lunar surface. It's a sodium-rich feldspar, but it's still worthwhile to look at since it's still a feldspar. So we can sort of determine like if all the feldspars have a similar behavior, which I'll talk about in a minute. And we have crystalline quartz, which crystalline quartz is not very common on the moon, but it's still worthwhile to look at since it's a good reference material and we know a lot about it. So what I mean by mineral reactivity? Well, so whenever you have like bombardments on the moon, you can cause a lot of defects in minerals. And so these defect sites can react with liquids to produce chemicals such as hydrogen peroxide and OH radicals. Iron present in minerals can also generate OH radicals. So this has a, is there a pointer? Just the top. Which one? I don't want to push the wrong button. Okay, well, so here at the bottom, ferrous iron reacts with hydrogen peroxide to create ferric iron, OH ions, and OH radical, which the OH radical is the guy here on the far right. So we use a technique called electron paramagnetic resonance spectroscopy, or EPR. And so EPR is very useful since we're generating hydroxyl radicals. And since we're looking at radicals, EPR is able to detect paired electrons. So what happens is whenever we incubate our mineral powders is that we add a DMPO to the solution. So DMPO is able to grab the hydroxyl radical, so the guy on the left grabs the OH radical and forms that compound on the right that is pretty stable. And so the EPR is able to detect the guy on the right. And so pretty much whenever you get your spectra, the more intense that the peak is, the more OH radical you're making. So now moving on to my data. So pretty much what I did for all of my samples was I ground all the minerals for 5, 15, and 30 minutes. And in each of those batches, I incubated for 5, 15, and 30 minutes. So I had a total of 9 samples per mineral. So here I have the data for forcetrite that was incubated for 15 minutes. And so pretty much from this data, you can see that as you increase your grind time, that the peaks get slightly more intense. So meaning as you grind your minerals more, the more OH radical that you are making. And so really quick, I should probably say what the X and Y axes are. So the Y axis is just the absorbance by the electron of the microwave energy, and the X axis is just the magnetic field sweep. And so here we have augite and diopside. So pretty much these almost the same relationship. As you increase your grind time, you're forming more OH radical. These minerals become more reactive as you pulverize them down to smaller sizes. So augite and diopside have the same relationship as forcetrite. And so here we have our data for our felsic minerals, and as you can tell, the peaks are a lot less intense and the relationships are much harder to see. So the 5-minute grind time does produce a little bit less hydroxyl radical than the 15 and 30-minute grind time, but the 15 and 30-minute ground by night tend to be about the same. Same thing for albite. There's not much of a relationship that you can see from that, so there's not too much of a relationship between grind time and OH radical generation. And labradorite and quartz tend to be about the same. It's very hard to sort of see any peaks at all, so you might see a little blip right here. I don't have my laser pointer, but so pretty much here, you can see a tiny little blip there, and over there the same thing. You're not getting much of these radicals being produced for these type of minerals. And so this data might be a little bit easier to see than the previous data sets. So pretty much on the y-axis, I have hydroxyl radical concentration in micromoles, and on the x-axis, I have incubation time. And so the 3 lines on here just represent the different grind times. So it's a little bit easier to see as you increase your grind time. In this case, for a forcetrite, you're generating more hydroxyl radicals. So our 5-minute grind is at the bottom, and is the red line, and then the green line is the 15-minute grind. And the 30-minute grind is the blue line. So as you increase grind time and incubation time, you're generating a greater amount of hydroxyl radical. And same thing for augite and diopside. There is a linear relationship between hydroxyl radical generation and incubation time and grind time. And our felsic minerals are sort of all over the place. The relationship becomes a little more obscure. So our 5-minute grind time does a little, sort of makes like a little weird triangle shape. The 5-minute ground sample that was only incubated for 5 minutes comes out to about 0.26, and then you get a sharp increase and then a decrease again. The 15 and 30-minute ground samples, really there's not much of a difference. There's no relationship between incubation time and OH radical generation for the 30-minute ground albite. And here I have bitonite. So you do get an increase in OH radical generation with increased grind time. However, the difference between the 15-minute ground sample and the 30-minute ground sample is virtually almost the same. There's pretty much no difference, and you actually get a decrease in OH radical generation with incubation time. Labradorite and quartz, the relationships aren't really so clear, and for quartz here on the right, you tend to have about the same amount of OH radical being generated for the samples that are ground for 15 and 30 minutes. The 5-minute ground sample tends to be, it just came out way higher than the other two, so yeah, there's not really much of a clear relationship going on for OH radical generation and grind time. And so recently we tried to get the surface areas of all of our ground samples, and here I have the data set for forcetrite. So on the y-axis, I have millimoles of OH produced per meter squared. So whenever you normalize the OH radical generation per meter squared, we found that there was really no correlation with surface area and OH radical generation. So even as the surface area rose, we tended to see that the amount of OH radical made per meter squared was actually going down. So that was sort of surprising. So it's sort of something we want to look at in the future and see maybe why that is. So conclusions, so pretty much the minerals in the lunar mare tend to be more reactive. They produce more OH radical in solution compared to those in the highlands. So one could conclude that if you were to breathe in minerals that are made in, or that are found in the highlands, you know, you might not have such a bad effect, or might not have such a bad effect on your health. But that doesn't mean you still want to breathe them in, though. They're still bad for you. So pretty much the mafic minerals tend to be, you tend to have more orthosilicates and pyroxenes for your mafic minerals, and those tend to produce more OH radical compared to tectosilicates. That's something interesting I wanted to point out. In the future, what I want to do is I want to obtain EPR spectra of these samples, but I don't want to incubate them like in a solution. I want to just do them like dry. I want to put the dry powders in a tube and see if I could compare hydroxyl radical generation to the presence of defect sites and transition metals and see if I could come up with some sort of correlation there. And so, yeah, thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot. We have time for some questions.
If things are going down with increasing area as you grind the stuff, doesn't that just say it's more of a volume effect, or you know, that it doesn't depend on area of the particles?
Yeah, well,
it depends on the volume of the particles, which is not changing, I assume.
Well, it was like odd because we expected like as there's more area, if there's a lot of defect sites in these minerals, then if there's more area for reaction to occur, that you would increase the amount of OH radical formed. So that was sort of like a surprise to us, but I don't know. Huh? Yeah, it's kind of odd. I'm thinking maybe of doing some SEM measurements, seeing, I kind of heard a couple of people back at my school were saying that maybe that the shape of the grains are changing and that could have an effect on reactivity. So I want to try and see if maybe that has something to do with it. So that would be kind of cool to look at.
Yeah, I had a related question with that. Matt Sigler from PSI. Yeah, I mean, usually we talk about lunar grains as being very fractured and angular, and that sort of really affects the specific surface area versus grinding something. You're going to get a more rounded particle.
Yeah.
Can you do experiments somehow with a more shattered type of grinding somehow, or?
Well, I'm pretty. Again, like I don't know how angular these grains are compared to on the moon, so I would actually like to do the SEM work then to see how rounded or how sharp these grains are, and maybe that has something to do with the reactivity of the minerals. So that's something I would have to look at. Maybe the samples that were ground longer might, you know, be smoother, and that could cause a decrease in OH generation per meter squared.
Oh, one more question.
You can talk to me later if we don't have time.
Yeah, I guess I missed something. How were you forming the OH radicals on the grains?
So like my methods, is that what you're trying to say? Like,
Well, you just ground the grains and they.
oh yeah, so we ground the grains and then we incubate them in a solution of DMPO. So it's like a really tiny amount of DMPO and DI water, and
Okay.
that produces and that causes
the
OH
DMPO
radical.
pulls the hydroxyl off.
Yes, and then the DMPO grabs the hydroxyl radical that's formed, and that creates a more stable radical, which can be detected with EPR.
Yeah, my other question was, what are the error bars on those measurements? Because some of them you could barely see any sort of peak in the.
For the forstrite, I would say maybe about 10-15%. For the quartz and like bitonite, the FELSIC minerals, I'd say maybe about 20+%. So those are a little hard to reproduce, but overall, those always tend to produce much less OH radical than the mafic minerals.